I'm a police officer who survived the first 12 hours of the alien invasion, and this is my story. Before I begin, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. It was 5:43 a.m. when it happened. I remember checking my watch as the first reports came in. Strange lights in the sky, power outages across the west side of Lakewood, and multiple 911 calls about something crashing in Jefferson Park. Just another weird morning in a job full of them. Or so I thought. I was nearing the end of a graveyard shift, tired but alert enough, patrolling the quiet streets of this Denver suburb where nothing much ever happened. The radio crackled to life. Dispatches voice tight with an edge I hadn't heard before. All units, we have multiple reports of unidentified flying objects over the city. Air traffic control has confirmed these are not registered aircraft. Stand by for further instructions. My partner, Rodriguez, laughed from the passenger seat. Someone's been watching too many sci-fi movies. I smiled, but something didn't feel right. The dispatch operator was Teresa Wilson, 20-year veteran, unflappable even during the worst pileups and domestic calls. Her voice had a tremor to it. Unit 347. Respond to Jefferson Park, North Entrance. Reports of a crashed object, possible aircraft, and... Teresa paused. Unusual activity. Rodriguez stopped laughing. Unusual how? Caller described figures emerging from a glowing object. Probably kids with drones. But check it out. I hit the lights, but not the siren as we cut across town. The sky was still dark, just beginning to lighten at the edges with pre-dawn blue. But there was something else, something wrong with the darkness above us. Parts of it seemed to move. You seeing this? Rodriguez asked, leaning forward to look up through the windshield. Those aren't clouds. They weren't. Massive shapes hung silently over Denver, barely visible against the night sky, but unmistakably there, like shadows darker than the darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine as we pulled up to Jefferson Park. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Acrid, like burning metal, and something organic, something rotting. Steam rose from the wet grass, where a perfect circle of vegetation had been scorched black. In the center sat what looked like a metallic seed pod, about the size of a small car, its surface gleaming with an oily iridescence that didn't reflect light so much as absorb it. Get dispatch on the radio, I told Rodriguez as I stepped out of the cruiser. Tell them we need backup and hazmat. This is no drone. The air felt wrong, charged somehow, making the hair on my arm stand up. My hand drifted to my service weapon, a reassuring weight on my hip. 20 feet from the object, I stopped. Something moved on the far side of the pod. A shadow, low to the ground, darting between trees. Police, stay where you are. I called out, unsnapping my holster. The shadow stopped. Then it rose and rose and rose. What I thought was crouching was simply its natural posture. Now it stood nearly 8 feet tall, a slender figure with too many joints in its limbs. The pre-dawn light caught it just enough for me to see its skin wasn't skin at all, but something like an insect's carapace, reflecting blue-black in the darkness. Holy shit, I breathed, drawing my weapon. Police officer, do not move. The thing tilted what might have been its head, studying me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel, like a physical pressure against my skin. Rodriguez was out of the car, now, his weapon also drawn. Central, this is Unit 347. We have, he faltered, a non-human entity at Jefferson Park. Repeat, we have confirmed non-human contact. The creature took a step forward, its movement fluid yet wrong, like watching a spider walk on water. My finger tightened on the trigger. Stop right there. I shouted. It didn't. Another step. Then another. I fired a warning shot into the ground before it. The report echoed across the park, startlingly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. The creature paused, its head tilting the other way. It made a sound then, not with anything like a mouth, but a vibration that seemed to come from its entire body. A thrumming that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. More movement caught my eye, not one creature but 3, for 5 of them, emerging from the tree line. All tall, all wrong, all moving toward us with that same liquid grace. Get in the car, I told Rodriguez, backing up slowly. Now, we didn't make it. The air shimmered between us and the cruiser, like heat waves on summer pavement. Another of the creatures simply appeared there, as if it had stepped through an invisible door. Up close, I could see more details, limbs that bent in too many places, digits that split and split again into delicate, deadly-looking points. No face, just a smooth, reflective surface where features should be, which somehow made it worse. Rodriguez fired. The creature jerked as the bullet hit its torso, a splash of luminous blue erupting from the wound. But it didn't fall. Instead, that thrumming sound intensified, becoming a piercing whine that drove needles of pain into my ears. Rodriguez dropped his weapon, clutching his head. I staggered, my vision swimming. Through watering eyes, I saw the creature reach for him with those two long arms, those too many fingers. I emptied my magazine into it. More luminous blue, more thrumming, but it faltered, its movements becoming erratic. The others paused their advance. I grabbed Rodriguez by his vest and dragged him backward, away from creatures, away from our cruiser. His nose was bleeding, eyes unfocused. The thrumming intensified again, and I knew the creatures were communicating. Planning. Central. I gasped into my shoulder mic. Officers need immediate assistance. Hostile non-human entities. They're attacking. The radio squealed with feedback, then went dead. In the distance, I heard sirens, but they weren't coming closer. They were all over the city, a rising chorus of emergency responses. This wasn't just happening here. Rodriguez groaned, coming back to his senses. What the fuck are those things? Later, I said, pulling him to his feet. We need to move. Now. The eastern sky was lightening now, revealing more of the massive shapes hanging above the city. Not clouds, not planes, but ships. Dozens of them, vast and silent, their hulls reflecting nothing. And from them, more seed pods were falling, streaking down like silent shooting stars. It wasn't a crash we'd found. It was a landing, an arrival. And this was just the beginning. We ran. Not toward the station, which was our first instinct, but away from population centers. The creatures seemed drawn to technology. They disabled our cruiser and our radios with that thrumming sound, and reports coming in over my still functional personal phone told of similar encounters across the city. Cars stalled, communications failed, and people died wherever these things appeared. By 6:30 a.m., just 47 minutes after the first pod landed, Denver was in chaos. The National Guard had been mobilized, but their vehicles stopped working as soon as they approached the landing zones. Helicopter gunships fired on the larger ships, only to fall from the sky, their electronics fried by some invisible force. Rodriguez and I found temporary shelter in an abandoned gas station. The power was out, but the building was concrete and metal, offering some protection. A small group of civilians had already holed up there, a middle-aged couple, a teenager with a broken arm, and an elderly man who'd been a paramedic before retiring. He was tending to Rodriguez, whose nosebleed had stopped, but who still wasn't entirely lucid. These things hit Central Park too, the teenager said, cradling his arm. My dad was jogging there. He called me, said they were taking people, just grabbing them and taking them back to the ships. Any word from the police station? I asked, try my phone again. No signal. The older man shook his head. Radio said police headquarters got hit directly. One of them big ships just parked right over it. Nobody's come out since. My stomach dropped. Most of our force would have been changing shifts, briefing the day officers. Harper, Chun, Williams, Gutierrez, friends, colleagues, all potentially gone. What do they want? The woman asked, her voice cracking. Why are they doing this? Nobody had an answer. Outside, the morning had fully dawned, but the light was wrong, filtered through the massive ships that now hung lower in the sky, blocking the sun in places, casting massive shadows over parts of the city. Smoke rose from downtown, and the sporadic gunfire we'd been hearing was becoming less frequent. Rodriguez finally sat up, wiping dried blood from his face. We need to warn people. These things, they do something to your head when they make that sound, like they're trying to shut down your brain. Not just brains, I said, checking my dead phone. All technology. Cars, phones, probably the helicopters too. Everything just stops working near them. EMP, the former paramedic suggested. Rodriguez shook his head. More targeted. Our guns still worked. It's like they can choose what to shut down. A loud crash from outside made us all freeze. Through the grimy gas station window, I saw another seed pod landing in the intersection, its impact cracking the asphalt. The metal shell began to unfold, revealing more of the tall figures inside. Back room, I whispered, gesturing everyone away from the windows. Now, we huddled in the storeroom among boxes of snacks and cigarettes, listening as that now familiar thrumming began outside. Metal shelving rattled. Dust fell from the ceiling. They're scanning, Rodriguez whispered, looking for technology or people. The thrumming intensified, focusing on our location. My head began to pound, vision blurring around the edges. The others felt it too, grimacing in pain. The teenager whimpered, blood beginning to trickle from his ear. Then it stopped, completely. The silence that followed was almost as painful as the sound had been. "Are they gone?" the woman whispered after a long moment. I crept to the door, peering through a crack. The creatures were still there, gathered around their pod. But they weren't alone. A military Humvee lay on its side nearby, smoke pouring from its engine. 3 soldiers in combat gear were being dragged from the wreckage by the creatures, their bodies limp but alive. One by one, the soldiers were placed inside the pod. Then the creatures followed. The pod sealed itself, and with a sound like rushing air, it lifted off, rejoining one of the massive ships overhead. "They are taking people," I said, returning to the group. "But they seem to want them alive." "That's supposed to be reassuring," the teenager asked. "It means we have time," Rodriguez said. "If they wanted us all dead, we'd be dead already." "So what do we do?" asked the older man. I checked my watch. 7:15 a.m. Less than 2 hours since the first landing, and the world had already changed irrevocably. But one thing hadn't changed, my duty. "We need to get these people somewhere safe," I told Rodriguez. "Then find out what the department's response is, if there is one." "Safe where?" he asked. "These things are landing all over the city." I thought for a moment. Underground. The subway system, service tunnels. If their technology affects electronics, concrete and dirt might shield us. And we need to warn others, find working radios, spread the word about what we've learned. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. And right now, something was all we had. By 8 a.m., we'd made our way to a subway entrance near the city center. The power was out here too, the station dark except for emergency lighting. A few dozen people had already taken shelter on the platforms, guided there by a transit worker who'd had the same idea we did. "The train stopped running when the ships appeared," he told us. "Most people evacuated, but we've been gathering stragglers. The tunnels seem safe so far. Those things don't like coming underground." I believed it. We'd had to dodge several patrols of the creatures on our way here, hiding in buildings or alleyways as they passed. They moved with purpose now, systematically checking structures, collecting technology and people. They seemed to prefer areas with higher population density or technological infrastructure. The subway would provide temporary shelter, but we needed information. I approached a group of people huddled around a battery-powered radio. "Any news?" I asked. A woman in a business suit looked up. "Just emergency broadcasts. The military's establishing a perimeter around the city, but they can't get close to the ships without their equipment failing. The president's declared a state of emergency nationally. This isn't just happening here. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, D.C. all hit simultaneously." "What about other countries?" "Same thing, from what they're saying. London, Moscow, Beijing, Tokyo, everywhere. It's global." The scale of it hit me then. This wasn't a localized incident we could contain. It wasn't an attack we could repel. It was an invasion, worldwide and overwhelming. Another man joined our conversation, a security guard based on his uniform. I heard they're emptying hospitals, taking the equipment, the patients, the staff. Same with research facilities, power plants, anything high-tech. "They're studying us," Rodriguez said quietly. learning about our technology, our biology. Why? Asked the businessman. What do they want? Before anyone could offer theories, a young woman rushed down the stairs into the station. They're coming, she gasped. They're checking the subway entrances. Panic rippled through the crowd. I raised my hands, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. Everyone stay quiet. Move deeper into the tunnels, away from the entrance. We hustled people down the platform and into the mouth of the dark tunnel. I could hear that thrumming again, distant but growing closer. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off tile walls and concrete floors. What's the plan? Rodriguez asked quietly as we shepherded the last stragglers into the darkness. We keep these people safe, find a working communication system, and contact whatever command structure is left. Same as before. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. We were making this up as we went along, and against an enemy this advanced, improvisation didn't seem like a winning strategy. The thrumming grew louder. Dust fell from the tunnel ceiling as the creatures entered the station above. Light fixtures swayed, and I could feel that pressure building in my head again. Keep moving, I whispered to the group. Quietly, we crept deeper into the tunnel, guided by the dim glow of emergency lights. Behind us, the thrumming reached a painful intensity, then suddenly stopped. They were in the station now, searching. I motioned for everyone to freeze, holding my breath as I listened. Strange clicking sounds echoed through the tunnel, like claws on concrete. They were coming. Service door, the transit worker whispered, pointing to a metal door set into the tunnel wall ahead. Maintenance access. It leads to a different tunnel system. We hurried the group toward it, wincing at every footfall that seemed too loud. The door was locked, but Rodriguez and I put our shoulders to it, forcing it open with a screech of protesting metal that seemed deafening in the quiet tunnel. The clicking behind us accelerated, accompanied by that brain-piercing thrumming. They'd heard us. Go, 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 I urged, practically shoving people through the doorway into a narrow maintenance corridor beyond. Rodriguez went through last, and together we pulled the heavy door shut just as the first of the creatures rounded the corner, its elongated silhouette visible in the emergency lighting. The maintenance corridor was pitch black once the door closed. Someone activated a phone flashlight, illuminating a claustrophobic concrete passage that stretched into darkness. Where does this lead? I asked the transit worker. Connects to the city's service tunnel system eventually. Miles of passages for utilities, maintenance, old flood control. It would have to do. We moved quickly through the darkness, guided by the meager light of 2 cell phones. The thrumming continued behind us, muffled by the door, but persistent. They were trying to get through. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached a junction where our narrow corridor opened into a larger tunnel system. Pipes ran along the ceiling, carrying water or gas, or who knew what else to the city above. It was damp and cold, but far from the creatures and their ships. Let's rest here, I said, noting the exhaustion on everyone's faces. Take stock of what we have, figure out next steps. Our group of refugees had grown to about 30 people, the gas station survivors, the subway crowd, and a few others who joined along the way. We had minimal supplies, whatever people happened to be carrying when the invasion began. A few bottles of water, some snack foods, a couple of flashlights, and 3 cell phones with rapidly depleting batteries. Not enough for long-term survival. We need to find out what's happening up there, I told Rodriguez, as the civilians settled onto the damp concrete floor. And we need supplies if we're going to stay down here. He nodded. I'll go with you. I shook my head. These people need protection. If those things find them down here, they'll need someone who knows how to fight. We both knew it was a token gesture. Our handguns had barely slowed the creatures down, but it made us feel better to pretend we could make a difference. The security guard volunteered to come with me. He had a flashlight and knowledge of the downtown area, both valuable assets. We left Rodriguez with instructions to move the group deeper into the tunnel system if we didn't return within 3 hours. Then began the long climb back toward the surface. The city above was transformed when we emerged through a maintenance, hatch into an alley shortly after 10 a.m. The morning was unnaturally dark, the massive ships now hovering just a few hundred feet above the tallest buildings, casting everything in shadow. The air smelled of smoke and that strange metallic organic odor I'd first noticed at Jefferson Park. From our vantage point, I could see seed pods continuing to land across the city. Some opened to release more of the tall creatures, while others remained sealed, perhaps serving different functions. The creatures moved with purpose through the streets, entering buildings, emerging with technology or unconscious humans. The security guard, Bill was his name, pointed to a grocery store across the street. "That's our best bet for supplies." I nodded, but getting there wouldn't be easy. A patrol of 4 creatures moved methodically down the main street, checking each building. We'd have to time our crossing carefully. We waited until they entered a bank on the corner, then sprinted across the open street to the grocery store's back entrance. The door was unlocked, the store apparently abandoned in a hurry when the invasion began. Inside, we found a scene of partial looting, some shelves emptied, others untouched. "Grab water, non-perishable food, batteries, first aid supplies," I whispered to Bill. "Anything useful that's left." We filled 2 shopping carts with supplies, working quickly in the semi-darkness of the powerless store. Through the front windows, I could see more creatures moving past, their elongated silhouettes unmistakable even in the strange half-light. They paused outside, that thrumming sound beginning again. "They're scanning the building," I whispered, pulling Bill down behind a checkout counter. "Stay still." The thrumming intensified, focusing on the store. My head began to pound again, vision blurring at the edges. Beside me, Bill groaned, blood trickling from his nose. The creatures were coming inside. I looked frantically around for another exit, spotting a door marked basement storage near the back. "This way," I mouthed to Bill, abandoning one cart but dragging the other with essential supplies. We slipped through the door and down a flight of stairs just as the creatures entered the front of the store. The basement was pitch black, but Bill's flashlight revealed rows of metal shelving stacked with overstock inventory. More importantly, there was another door at the far end with an exit sign above it. "Fire escape," Bill whispered. We hurried toward it, the thrumming sound following us down the stairs. The door led to an external stairwell that descended to the alley behind the store. We practically threw the cart down the stairs, wincing at the clattering noise, then followed it down to street level. The alley was clear for the moment, but I could hear the creatures moving around the side of the building, drawn by the noise. We grabbed what supplies we could carry in backpacks and shopping bags, abandoning the cart, and ran for the maintenance hatch we'd emerged from earlier. We'd almost reached it when a new sound split the air, a high-pitched, keening wail that seemed to come from the ships themselves. It rose in intensity until it was almost unbearable, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. In the silence that followed, the creatures around us froze, their elongated bodies going rigid. Then, as one, they began to return to their pods, moving with an urgency I hadn't seen before. "What's happening?" Bill asked. I shook my head, watching as pod after pod sealed itself and lifted off, rejoining the ships above. "I don't know, but we should get underground while we can." By the time we descended back into the tunnel system and made our way to the group, it was past noon. Rodriguez was organizing the civilians into shifts for rest and watch duty, his police training evident in the orderly arrangement of our makeshift refugee camp. "You're back," he said with evident relief, then nodded at our supplies. "Good haul." "Something's changed up there," I told him, distributing water bottles to the group. "The creatures are retreating back to the ships. All of them, all at once." Retreating. The hope in his voice was painful to hear. "Are they leaving?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. The ships are still there. It's like they're regrouping for something." A woman with a battery-powered emergency radio approached us. "You need to hear this," she said, turning up the volume on a news broadcast that faded in and out with static. Confirmed reports from multiple cities. The invaders appear to be withdrawing from urban centers, but the ships remain in position. Military analysts suggest this may be a tactical repositioning rather than a retreat. All civilians are advised to remain in secure locations. The president will address the nation at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The broadcast dissolved into static again. I checked my watch, about 20 minutes until the address. "Can we get that down here?" I asked, pointing to the radio. The woman shook her head. "Signals too weak underground. We need to go closer to the surface." Rodriguez and I exchanged looks. "I'll go," he said. "Find a spot where we can get reception. Listen to what the president has to say. Maybe they've figured something out." I didn't like splitting up again, but information was crucial. "Be careful. Those things could come back anytime." He nodded, taking the radio and a flashlight. "I'll find a maintenance room near an exit, get the broadcast, and come straight back." As he disappeared down the tunnel, I distributed the supplies we'd gathered and briefed the group on what we'd seen above. I didn't sugarcoat it. The city was effectively under alien control, with no sign of successful resistance, but I also emphasized that we were safe for now, underground and undetected. "What happens when the food runs out?" someone asked. "We can't stay down here forever." "One problem at a time," I said, though the question had been haunting me too. "First we get information, then we make a plan." But as 1 hour stretched into 2 with no sign of Rodriguez, I began to worry. The presidential address would have ended by now. He should have been back. I was preparing to go search for him when a distant sound echoed through the tunnels, footsteps, running, accompanied by ragged breathing. Everyone tensed, those with weapons reaching for them. Rodriguez burst into our makeshift camp, his face ashen, the radio clutched in his hand. "They're coming," he gasped. "All of them. They're mobilizing again." "What happened?" I asked, helping him sit down. "Did you hear the address?" He nodded, still catching his breath. "The president. He said they've been analyzing the aliens' patterns. They're methodically harvesting our technology, our infrastructure, and us, taking samples of everything." "For what purpose?" "Research, they think. Assessment. These first waves were just data collection." He looked up at me, his eyes haunted. "But now they're moving to phase 2. Mass collection. They're going to sweep through each city systematically, building by building, block by block. Take everything they want, everyone they want." "When?" someone asked, voice quavering. Rodriguez checked his watch. "Now. It's already starting in eastern cities. Moving westward. Denver's turn comes at 5 p.m. local time." I looked at my own watch. 3:17 p.m. Less than 2 hours. Did they say how to fight them? Any weaknesses? I asked. He shook his head. "Conventional weapons are ineffective. EMPs don't work. These things operate on principles we don't understand. The military's trying nuclear options on isolated ships over unpopulated areas. But..." He trailed off. "But what?" "But they're not optimistic. And they're evacuating everyone they can to designated safe zones outside major cities. They said anyone still in urban centers after the sweep begins should be considered lost." A stunned silence fell over the group. "So we're trapped," someone finally said. "They're writing us off." "No," I said firmly. "We're not trapped. We're just behind enemy lines. And we got 2 hours to get as many people out as possible." It seemed impossible. We were 30 people in a tunnel, with no transportation, no communications, and limited supplies, facing an enemy that could disable technology at will and incapacitate humans with sound alone. But giving up wasn't an option. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, summoning every ounce of authority I could muster. "Bill, you know these tunnels. Where do they lead outside the city?" The security guard thought for a moment. "There's a drainage system that connects to Lakewood Creek, follows the old flood control channels out past the western suburbs. If we follow it, we could emerge outside the city limits." "How far?" 5-6 miles of tunnels. Some sections might be partially flooded this time of year. It wasn't ideal, but it was our best shot. "Everyone grab what you can carry. Food, water, medical supplies. We move in 5 minutes." As the group hurriedly packed, Rodriguez pulled me aside. "There are more people up there," he said quietly. "Thousands still in the city. We can't just leave them." The weight of his words pressed down on me. He was right, of course. But what could we do? We need to warn them, I decided. Split up. You lead these people through the tunnels. I'll go back up, try to direct as many as I can to safe zones or underground. That's suicide, he said flatly. Maybe, but it's the job. He looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. How will you find us again? I smiled grimly. I'll follow the drainage tunnels west. Might be a day or two behind you, but I'll catch up. We both knew it was unlikely I'd make it, but pretending gave us comfort. Rodriguez extended his hand. Been an honor serving with you. I clasped it firmly. Likewise. Now get these people to safety. We parted ways at a tunnel junction. Rodriguez leading the civilians westward through the drainage system. Me heading back toward the surface with a backpack of supplies and my service weapon. I'd insisted on going alone, despite several offers to accompany me. No sense risking more lives than necessary. It was 3:45 p.m. when I emerged into the alien-shadowed city once more. The scene had changed again. The ships were lower now, massive and ominous, their hulls reflecting nothing. The seed pods had multiplied, hundreds of them positioned at strategic locations throughout the city. The creatures moved in formation, gathering at staging areas, clearly preparing for a coordinated operation. I kept to the shadows, moving from building to building, searching for survivors. Most had already fled or been taken, but I found small groups hiding in basements, storage rooms, and parking garages. I directed them to subway entrances and maintenance hatches, described the tunnel systems and the western drainage route. Some followed my advice, others were too afraid to move, certain they'd be safer staying hidden. By 4:30 p.m., I'd covered several blocks and warned perhaps 100 people. It wasn't enough, nowhere near enough, but it was something. I was checking an apartment building when my radio crackled to life for the first time since early morning. All units. This is Captain Vasquez at the western perimeter. We have established an evacuation corridor along Highway 6. Military escorts are providing cover. Any officers in the field, direct civilians to Checkpoint Delta. Repeat, Checkpoint Delta on Highway 6. We hold until 5 p.m., then we fall back. This is our last transmission from this position. I grabbed the radio. Captain Vasquez, this is Officer Price. I'm downtown with civilians. What's the best route to your position? Static then, Price? Jesus, we thought everyone downtown was gone. Get to Federal Boulevard, head west. It's 4 miles to our position. But you need to hurry. These things are massing for something big. Copy that. On our way. I had less than 30 minutes to gather as many people as I could and make a 4-mile journey through alien-occupied streets. Impossible odds, but I'd stopped counting the impossible things I'd seen today. I ran through the apartment building, pounding on doors, gathering the dozen or so residents I found. Outside, I flagged down other groups of survivors, forming a ragged column of about 30 people. I explained the situation, a temporary escape corridor to the west, military protection, but a closing window of opportunity. Stay together, I told them. Move quickly but quietly. Follow me. We set off west, keeping to side streets, moving from cover to cover. The sky darkened further as 5 p.m. approached, the alien ships descending even lower, their massive hulls now just a few hundred feet above the tallest buildings. The thrumming sound began again, building gradually, emanating from every pod and ship simultaneously. We were still 2 miles from the evacuation point when the first phase of the sweep began. It started with a pulse, visible as a ripple through the air, like heat waves on summer asphalt, spreading outward from each ship. When it passed over us, every electronic device went dead instantly. Watches stopped, cell phones died, even battery-powered flashlights failed. Then came the creatures, emerging from every pod in the city simultaneously, hundreds of them, thousands, spreading out in a coordinated pattern. They moved building by building, block by block, just as Rodriguez had described, systematically entering and clearing each structure. Behind them came floating orbs, metallic spheres about the size of beach balls, which gathered up technology, computers, appliances, vehicles, using some kind of tractor beam. We pressed ourselves into the shadow of an underpass as a patrol of creatures moved past, dragging unconscious humans toward a waiting pod. When they'd passed, we continued our desperate flight westward. The thrumming intensified with each passing minute, creating a pressure that made it hard to think, hard to move. Several people in our group began bleeding from their noses and ears. One collapsed, unable to continue. We had to leave him, though it tore at my soul to do so. Through sheer determination, we kept moving one block at a time, as the city was systematically emptied behind us. The creatures were moving west to east in their sweep, which gave us a narrow window of opportunity, staying just ahead of their advance. The sun was setting as we finally came within sight of Highway 6. Half a mile ahead, I could see military vehicles, soldiers directing people onto transport trucks. The evacuation corridor. Safety. But between us and them stood a line of the alien creatures, a blockade across our path. They hadn't seen us yet, focused on processing a group of civilians they'd already captured. I gathered our group in the shadow of an abandoned gas station. "We can't go around," I said quietly. "There's no time. We have to go through." "How?" someone asked. "There are too many of them." I had no clever strategy, no brilliant plan. Just desperation and duty. "I'll create a diversion. When they come after me, you all run for the checkpoint. Don't stop, don't look back." Protests arose. They couldn't leave me. It was suicide. There had to be another way. But the creatures were already beginning to turn in our direction, that awful thrumming focusing on our location. "No time to argue," I said. "When you see the opening, run. That's an order." Before anyone could stop me, I stepped out from our hiding place, fired my service weapon into the air, and began sprinting away from the evacuation route, shouting at the top of my lungs. The thrumming immediately shifted, focusing on me with painful intensity. Through blurring vision, I saw the creatures turn, their elongated forms beginning to pursue me. It worked. As the majority of the creatures followed me, the path to the checkpoint cleared. Our group of survivors broke cover, running for the military position. I caught a glimpse of them being waved through by soldiers, boarding transport trucks, before I had to focus entirely on my own survival. The creatures were fast, faster than any human. The thrumming sound they emitted grew stronger as they closed the distance, sending waves of pain through my skull. I zigzagged through abandoned cars trying to break their line of sight, but they adjusted effortlessly, those two long limbs eating up the distance between us. My lungs burned, legs screaming with fatigue. I'd been running on adrenaline for 12 hours straight, and my body was reaching its limits. The creatures were 20 yards behind me, then 15, then 10. I ducked into an alleyway, hoping for some advantage in the tighter space. Instead, I found a dead end. Brick walls on 3 sides, no fire escapes, no doors. Just me, a dumpster, and the approaching aliens. I turned, back against the wall, service, weapon raised. It had barely slowed them down before, but it was all I had left. The first creature appeared at the alley entrance, its impossibly tall silhouette blocking what little light remained. Behind it, 3 more gathered, those faceless heads tilting as they regarded me. The thrumming intensified until I could barely stay conscious, blood trickling from my nose, vision swimming. Still, I kept my weapon trained on them as they advanced. I fired repeatedly, each shot finding its mark, splashes of luminous blue erupting from their bodies. They slowed, but didn't stop. I emptied my magazine, reached for a spare, knowing it was futile, but refusing to die without a fight. As the creatures closed the final distance, something unexpected happened. A deafening roar filled the alley as a military helicopter appeared overhead, spotlight blazing down on us. Gunfire erupted from its mounted weapon, tearing into the creatures with a ferocity my handgun couldn't match. The aliens recoiled, that thrumming sound shifting to a higher pitch. The helicopter shouldn't have been able to function this close to them, but somehow it was. "Grab a rope," a voice shouted over a loudspeaker. A thick rope ladder descended into the alley beside me. I didn't question the miracle. I holstered my empty weapon and leapt for the ladder, grabbing hold as the helicopter immediately began to ascend. The creatures reached for me, those too many fingers grasping at air as I was lifted away. From above, I could see the full scope of what was happening. The western evacuation corridor was holding, but barely. Military forces had established a defensive line, using what looked like modified vehicles and weapons that somehow functioned despite the aliens' technology-disrupting abilities. Behind us, Denver was being systematically emptied. Block by block, building by building, the creatures collected everything of value: technology, resources, and people. The massive ships had descended even further, now hovering just above the tallest skyscrapers, casting the city in deep shadow despite the setting sun. The helicopter carried me to the evacuation checkpoint, setting down behind the military cordon. As my feet touched the ground, my legs finally gave out. A medic rushed forward, helping me to a nearby medical tent. "Officer Price," a voice asked. I looked up to see Captain Vasquez, her uniform dirty and torn, a bandage wrapped around her forearm. "Captain," I managed. "How did the helicopter work?" "Their technology. Faraday cages," she explained. "The engineers figured it out about an hour ago. The aliens emit some kind of directed electromagnetic pulse, shield the electronics properly, and they still function. We've been retrofitting what vehicles we can, trying to hold this corridor open as long as possible." I looked around at the organized chaos of the evacuation point. Soldiers directed civilians onto transport trucks. Medics treated the injured. Military engineers worked frantically on vehicles, wrapping components in what looked like metallic mesh. "How many got out?" I asked. "Maybe half the city's population," Vasquez said grimly. The early warnings helped. People who were already in the suburbs or who evacuated immediately got clear. The rest. She didn't need to finish. I told her about the survivors in the tunnel system, about Rodriguez leading them west through the drainage channels. She immediately dispatched a team to find them and bring them in. "Your group was the last to make it through," she said. "We're pulling back in 5 minutes. These things are still coming, and our retrofits are failing one by one." As if to emphasize her point, a modified Humvee on the perimeter suddenly died, its headlights flickering out. The thrumming sound was growing stronger again as the alien sweep approached our position. "Time to go," Vasquez said, helping me to my feet. "Last transport leaves now." We boarded a military truck along with a final group of soldiers and civilians. As we pulled away, I looked back at Denver one last time. The city where I'd served and protected for 8 years was now just a forest of shadowy skyscrapers beneath alien ships. Whatever they wanted from us, they were taking it methodically, efficiently, and completely. The truck wound its way into the foothills west of the city, joining a convoy of vehicles headed for a fallback position in the mountains. Nobody spoke much. Some people cried quietly. Others stared blankly ahead, shock evident in their expressions. "What happens now?" I asked Vasquez, who sat across from me. "Regroup, adapt, find a way to fight back." She sounded more hopeful than she looked. "The president's established a secure command center in the Rockies. The military's gathering what forces survived the initial attack, and the scientists are working around the clock to understand these things. And the rest of the world? Same situation everywhere. Major cities taken, rural areas still holding out. These things seem focused on population centers and technology hubs." I nodded, too exhausted to ask more questions. As the truck climbed higher into the mountains, I found myself thinking about those first moments at Jefferson Park, when the world still made sense and my biggest concern was finishing my shift on time. 12 hours. That's all it had taken for everything to change. 12 hours from first contact to the fall of Denver. 12 hours from normal life to fighting for survival in an alien invasion. And yet, here we were, still alive, still fighting, still human. I checked my watch out of habit, forgetting it had stopped at exactly 5 p.m. when the sweep began. It didn't matter. Time would be measured differently now, before the invasion and after. And after had only just begun. The truck continued its climb into the mountains as darkness fell completely. Behind us, the glow of Denver was visible not from its normal city lights, but from the eerie luminescence of the alien ships as they completed their harvest of everything we once called home. I closed my eyes not to sleep. I doubted I'd sleep normally ever again, but to prepare. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, perhaps new understanding of our enemy. My job remained the same, even if the world had changed: protect and serve. I am a police officer, and I survived the first 12 hours of the alien invasion. But this is just the beginning of our story.